In part 1, we learned that a broad range of chronic diseases are rising in America. But what exactly is causing this rise in various chronic diseases? In this video, we'll discover the diagnosis for what is causing our health predicament. But to understand that first requires understanding a little bit of economics. In 1930, John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most influential economist of the last century, wrote an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in his article, he predicted two things. First, that in 100 years from the time he was writing, so basically in our time, the economy would have grown eightfold. And second, that most people would only need to work about 15 hours a week. It turns out Keynes was correct on the first point. The economy did grow eightfold from the time of his prediction. But regarding the 15-hour work week, obviously he was wrong. Most of us are not working 15 hours a week. We work far more than that, and at least not uncommonly, some of us work over 40 hours a week. So what happened? Two things happened. The first thing that happened that Keynes apparently didn't foresee was that women would enter the labor force in large numbers. As you can see in this graph, in the 1960s and 70s all the way into the 1980s, women increasingly entered into the labor force. But when you think about that for a minute, it should strike you that, wait a minute, now suddenly many families would have two incomes. And if that's the case, then we should have become financially largely independent of our employers and needing to work fewer hours a week much earlier than what Keynes had predicted. Perhaps 50 years earlier. So instead of being at the point of working 15 hours a week by the year 2030, we should have got there by 1980 or so. Obviously, that's not what happened. So what was the real reason for the fact that we're working so much longer than Keynes had predicted? That comes down to a phenomenon that social scientists call social comparison, or what you and I know better as keeping up with the Joneses. And so when you look at the size of houses, for example, houses in the 1950s were about 980 square feet. By 1970, it was about 1,500 square feet, and by 2014, it was about 2,700 square feet. So what happened is this phenomenon where we are having to keep up with each other. We have gotten to normalizing things that we see around us. We thus think it is normal and essential to have much larger houses, with a room for every child and several more cars. We have thus accumulated more stuff in our houses than our parents and our grandparents ever had. In fact, one of the fastest growing segments of our economy is the off-site storage facilities that are popping up everywhere. And so what that tells us is that despite bigger housing and more garage space, we're also consuming a lot more than we ever have. Now, we have much more in our homes than our ancestors ever did, and that might be thought to be a good thing, but the evidence shows otherwise. If you look at levels of happiness over time, what you actually see is something a little disturbing. Our levels of GDP and productivity have increased tremendously over this period of time, but our levels of happiness have actually declined a little bit. That tells us once again that there's something very wrong with our way of living if we're becoming more unhappy and unhealthy as we go on. So that leads us to be able to make the diagnosis for what's causing the rise of chronic disease in America. And that is due to mindless consumerism. Mindless in the sense that we're consuming many things that don't actually improve our sense of happiness or well-being. And in fact, to a good extent, it actually detracts from our happiness. And so because of our overconsumption, we developed some unhealthy living habits that are the cause of the rise of chronic disease in America and abroad. Now, what you will probably think when you hear this is that doesn't quite make sense. How does spending money on goods and services, or consumerism, have anything to do with the rise of chronic disease in America and increasingly abroad? In the next video, we'll learn exactly this. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, because that will help me spread the message to others.